Good morning, everybody. Welcome. And those of you who hang out close to SAIT's campus now with snow on the ground, a familiar sight. So we may have one or two new people in the room. Craig will run us through the logistics when we really get into this. But if you're scooching around your screen, you may want to take note of the chat. And if you haven't seen it already, and the Q&A, which is there for you to use for your questions as we run through the morning. But before we go there, it is always important for us to invite you to pause with us. And our pause is to recognize and acknowledge where we are. So the picture that you can see is SAIT's main campus, that's Heritage Hall in Calgary, traditionally known as McKintis, where the Bow River meets the Elbow River. This is located on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot, the people of Treaty 7, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kaurna, the Tsuut'ina, the Îyârhe Nakoda of Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Goodstoney. We call it Calgary today, and it is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta. Thanks, Craig.
Perfect. Thank you, Jenny. And yes, as Jenny has highlighted, if you have been with us before, you know that the chat can take on a life of its own, and it's fantastic. There's always great conversation going on there, so please do keep it going. I am going to throw into the chat just something for everybody. We would love for you to follow SAIT Corporate Training on LinkedIn. And Jenny and I would love it if you were to connect with us as well. We'll be back in January 17th, 2025. That sounds strange to say, 2025. Talk about leader well-being. And there's links to, we take all of these sessions and we rip the audio into a podcast format. So if for some reason you do want to have me stuck in your ears as you're walking the dog, please do check out the podcast. But as Jenny mentioned, if you have a specific question, and we're going to encourage you today. Today's a bit of a, I'm going to call it a grab bag, look back on the past year. Jenny and I have got a couple topics that, we highlighted and we really liked in our discussions from the past year. But if there is a leadership question that you have wanted to pose, please do throw it into the Q&A. This is kind of your opportunity to, go off board even if you have to and ask us something that we haven't talked about yet. But Jenny, as I look back now, this is episode 77.
Correct.
77 times we've sat down on a Friday morning. There's been the odd Thursday morning in there, I'm sure. But what stuck out to you from the past year? We had a number of great conversations.
Yeah, we
what
did.
Stuck out to you?
Yeah, I had a skim through and I had a look at where did our big ideas sit? Where were we coming from? It's interesting to watch the flow of the year as well. And I think if we look at it, we can put it into three buckets. So we talked a lot this year about performance and growth and the importance of performance. Most recent ones, of course, on how to deal with poor performance. But we kicked off 2024 with how to put some energy back into your goal setting, secretly known as stop sucking the life out of your people and let's find some more energy. And we talked a little bit this year about feedback and the importance of becoming a noticer as opposed to giving advice. Not many people actually want your advice. That was a bit of the sort of hard-hitting part of that conversation. And of course, then we had one about prioritization as well, and the difficulty in prioritization with actually acknowledging out loud the competing commitments. And so in order to focus on something, we may have to give up something else. And then our second bucket was around engagement and connection. We've talked a lot about that. I think that what sort of common sentence nowadays is if you want to engage your people, do that, engage them. So we've talked a lot about having the right conversations. We did a little bit of service to engagement surveys and tried to bring them to life. And then really in that engagement piece, we had a great conversation with Ela Edgar around trust. And, even distrust is a choice. So the choices that we have in that space to help us with relationships and with teams. And then the last bucket, which was a bit of a general one, is that how do we lead? Like just leadership as a behavior. And we say that a lot. Amy Edmondson's quote, leadership is a behavior, leader is a title. So anyone can step into leadership. And within there, we talked a lot about how we show up. We talked about inclusion. We had John Partington join us, had a great conversation around calling in, calling out, privilege within our workspaces. But then we also had Curtis Braun join us and talk about neurodiversity. And so it's not always just about opening the door and letting people in. Sometimes it's about going to meet them where they're at as well. So it was a fascinating sort of addition to that inclusion conversation. And then the other areas that we included strategy. And I think a lot of actually, let's just be real and be human. And we've had a lot of that over the year as well. So that was my homework. At this point now, I'm open to you.
Yeah, no, we did touch on a lot. The performance one always sticks out for me because that always seems to be something that generates a ton of
Yeah,
interest and a ton of conversation. I think we could probably look back as well on our conversation around micromanagement. We might have had one or two on
yeah,
those.
yeah.
And then the other thing that we didn't actually directly discuss here, but we discussed on the podcast was culture,
We
right?
did. Yeah.
And if you haven't had a chance to listen to that, folks, I think it's worth checking out, if I can be so humble as to say that. But the concept around culture needing to be something that you intentionally focus on, really needing to think about the non-negotiables that are going to define your team and how
Mm-hmm.
you leverage the influencers and the energizers on your team to build great culture and to really think about how quickly culture can be killed by the wrong behavior. So I thought that was a four-part series that we did over the summer while we were away from the screen, so to speak. But I think, Jenny, maybe let's, if we can, because there's something in this performance conversation that I think that always it's one of these pieces around how do you address poor performance? How do you manage up when you have to deal with performance? That's something else we could perhaps summarize here. That managing up conversation is one that we frequently that comes up in the Q&A in terms of, well, I think I'm doing this well, but my boss,
Mm-hmm.
um, right? So double click on one of those.
It's such a great phrase, double click. All right, we're going now clickbait. So let's start on at a basic frame. If you want to manage up, we have to remember that the person that you're managing up to is a human as well. And we've talked about that a lot. We forget that. We're still very stuck to hierarchy, and hierarchy was created well over a century ago for a workplace that was completely different to now. And we've seen some places just try and flatten it completely. Doesn't always work. We need leadership of some kind. So we want to remember that they are a human. They're not untouchable. They're not, this Hollywood hero of any sort. The second thing is you can't have a great conversation if you don't have trust and a relationship with them. And the cool part when we dig into trust, relationship, psychological safety, whatever that might be, like whichever part you're looking at, is it's human and it's in your control. And so don't wait for them to build the trust. Start that conversation. Look for ways that you can do that. And then the other thing I think comes back to something I just mentioned in the sort of summary is when we talk from what we're noticing, it becomes a different conversation. And we have to remember in any conversation, my perspective is different than yours and my needs and wants are different than yours. And very often our leaders are concerned with outcomes and dashboards and numbers and pressure from on top of them, unless you report into your CEO or your board of directors. And so their pressure is different than our pressure. So we have to pay attention to both of those if we want that connection in the conversation.
Yeah, I think you called out a few really good things there. And we've talked about the fact, two things I'll click on. One is, have the conversation,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Unless you are certain that, the conversation is not going to go well, or there isn't that psychological or safety or trust that you have
Yeah.
to be able to engage in that conversation, odds are things won't go poorly. But you've got to make that judgment call in the moment. You know your leader, you know your situation best. But I think we often are hesitant to initiate those vibrant conversations, if you want to call them that.
There you go.
right?
Yep.
Just
Yep.
for fear of what might happen. But the other piece of it too is, and you started right with it, leaders are people too. And everybody in this chat here is a leader in their own right. They may have a
Hmm.
formal team, may have an informal team. They may be an individual contributor as well on some level, but you are still leading others by your actions. And this concept that the leader has to have it all figured out and be dialed in all the time,
Yeah.
just for me is one of these things that I keep thinking about going, it can't possibly be true. Because I know for me, I can't, right? And so I think, obviously as a leader, you need to try to be better and be cognizant. That's why you're in that leadership position. Somebody has said, we see this in you and believe that you can do it. And yes, you have to figure out a way at times to put your stuff aside and still be that leader. I don't know if that triggers anything for you, but there's a couple of things
Yeah,
that,
two things. And I'm going to try and remember both. This might go wrong. The first one was right at the beginning of what you said, and that fear of having the conversation.
yeah,
And the problem with when we get into that spiral is, what is the common phrase? Your energy, where your attention goes, your energy flows, or something along those lines. And the minute that I think this is going to be awful, scary, intimidating, whatever, I'm then focusing on that. And the more that we focus something in our mind, the more we magnify it.
yeah,
And really quickly, we blow it out of proportion. And anxiety, not clinical anxiety, that's a different thing. But anxiety in itself is a perceived threat. Perceived, we've made it up. And so we really want to back away from creating this big picture that we have no evidence has happened. And so sort of pulling yourself back from that that awful version. And if we really get stuck in there, one of the ways we can start that conversation is the story that I'm telling myself is, because it literally is that, it's a story. We create things all of
yeah,
the time. And I've done it. I've forgotten the second half that I was going to say is to do with you and human, not you personally, like leaders and being. Oh yeah. So if you are a leader, one of the things to remember too is if somebody challenges you or it feels like a challenge, because not everybody has the skill set to simply notice and come in with that
mm,
kindness. Really, is what it is a kindness that we're looking for. But if it feels like a challenge, that's a compliment. Because if your people feel safe enough to challenge you, you've got a degree of psychological safety in there. Because if they
absolutely.
don't feel safe enough, they won't. They won't have the conversation. If there's nothing coming back to you, that's probably more of a flag than people who are coming unhappy, or, you know, frustrated with something or whatever that might be. And all of those emotions don't happen without a reason. So it's hard in the minute, and our ego will never want us to do that. But this is great because I'd much rather have someone who come and have that conversation and share that information and we can do something with that than know nothing. And the other part to your piece there is just own the humanness. We're all,
Yeah.
if you can own a failure, own a mistake, own that you missed something out, you make it much easier for your team to do the same. And then the real work actually gets to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Stepping up and saying, "Hey, my bad.
Yeah.
It was a bad
Yeah.
day." Something. Yeah, absolutely. As a leader, though, I think the thing you have to remember is if you're doing that day after day, you might need to take a closer look in the mirror and say, "Okay, what do I need to change?" Right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yep.
I love Tom your comment here in the chat. Leaders need to remember you can do anything, you just can't do everything.
Hmm.
I love that. And as a leader, you're trying to generate results, easy for me to say, through other people's efforts, right?
Yep.
Your job as a leader isn't to actually do the work, it's to generate the results through others, which is for first-time leaders, I think, and I know we didn't really touch on this, Jenny, but we might want to lean into this a little bit. But as a first-time leader, that's probably one of the biggest adjustments you need to make.
It is. And it's tough because we still, in many, many organizations and places, have leaders being promoted because they're good at the job. And so all of a sudden you move from being the one that was good at the job to being the one that looks after the people who do the job. And that's a pretty hard transition to do because doing the job and doing it well is your comfort zone. And people might not be your comfort zone. That might be a harder piece within there. The other thing too that pops up in there as well is, you sort of you have your way and it's tried and it's tested and it's given you quality results. That's why you got promoted. And then somebody wants to come and do it a different way. And that's a struggle sometimes as well. And in some roles, in some job places, we work with a lot of people who are in the trades. Sometimes there is only one way to do it, and we're never ever going to mess with that. Like if it is a compliance and a matter between life and death, we're not messing in there at all. But in a lot of our knowledge work, where we also spend a lot of our time, there's many different ways to get to the outcome. And so part of the skill becomes, what is it that I'm looking for? And that's another conversation that doesn't happen enough is what does finish look like? What does success look like? What is the I don't want to use the word expectation because we've talked about that too. Expectation can just slap a ceiling on there and we can get stuck really quickly. What's the possibility? Like, where are we going to? And
Yeah.
that's a healthy conversation to keep revisiting too, because as a leader, just because you said it once doesn't mean it's landed with all of the people.
No, absolutely. There's a reason we see advertisements many, many times because it takes a while for them to stick. So
Yeah.
why do you think, yeah, to your point, saying it once and being done just generally doesn't work.
Nope.
But I'm going to lean into this a little bit more because I think it ties back into something you called out earlier is advice versus noticing, right? And I think in that situation of that first time leader who was a great performer now being put into that leadership position,
Mm-hmm.
your gut reaction is probably to, well, advise, this is how I do it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Versus noticing perhaps what it
Yeah.
is you're doing. So,
For those who want the double click over the holidays, and in fact, I think a big idea today comes from him. In fact, I'm sure it does. Michael Bungay Stanier talks brilliantly about advice. And there's basically three things that force us into giving advice quickly. I want to be in control. I want to try and fix things. There's a lot of us that are fixers out there.
mhm.
And also that need, kind of that need to be right, really. And within those three, what happens is we're so quick to give advice because we think we know. And we do know based on our story and our experience that we don't actually ever listen properly to the person in front of us. And so there's another skill in there that really deserves some attention is that listening skill. And everybody goes, oh yes, active listening. And we also and it's so much more than that. My favorite version of listening actually is the difference between a regular listening is stingy listening. And then in order to listen properly, there's a generosity with it. And that's tough. It is active, but it's also pretty skilled to get there. And nobody, I don't think, can generously listen all of the time. Again, we're human. And so, first off, how do we hear the person in front of us? But secondly, if we notice, we're observing rather than telling. And that really ties in. And I think you and I talked about this in that culture series quite a bit, is that, we hire adults with a skill set. We don't hire people who come to work and want to feel like they're at school again or feel like they're being parented again. We've all passed that test. We've been there. We've done it. And so by noticing, observing rather than interpreting or telling, we can say what we're seeing from our perspective. There might be something useful. And on the flip side of that, I'll offer to everybody, and this is tough, and I struggle with this daily. Every feedback has a truth of some kind. So what are you going to take from there? And that's the choice on our
Yeah. Wow, there's a ton in there.
half.
As
Sorry.
always. No, it's good. We've spurred a couple comments, questions here that I think we can keep following up on. And I love Tom again. Gold star this morning, Tom. Leadership is a completely different skill set, and we often don't prepare our new leaders for that. Absolutely. And so, kind of two questions that come together here. Any advice on how, as a company, we can make the transition easier for the high performers going into leadership and set them up better for success? So how do we You take our top performers and help set them up better for success. Obviously,
I'm
send them to SATE
laughing.
for some training,
Yeah,
right? We'll help you out,
yeah, I
but
know.
yeah.
The obvious answer to that is yes, we'll come and hang out with you for a while and you'll be good. Happy Christmas. So it I think the pure fact, the awareness that people need help, the awareness that people don't have this skill set is huge. And then it's looking at what do we want our leaders to have? Because of our time in here, I'll go to a couple of things. The two poorest skills that I bump into all the time is the ability to delegate and the
Mhm.
ability to give good feedback. And I am flipping the switch on that feedback quite sort of purposefully these days. And Craig and I are going to talk about this. Craig, you'll probably know the date I don't. Second conversation in January is going
January
to be all
31st.
around. Say again.
January 31st.
See, there, I knew you would know. Um, Around that feedback idea, because I don't think it's much about giving as it is about asking. And so that's going to be a flip
Mhm.
on that one. So setting people up for that part. And then I think the two other things that are crucial, and these work across any organization, is how do we operationalize trust and psychological safety? And I can go on for ages. We can then talk about your emotional intelligence. Like there's so much in there. But what we do a lot is we recognize like lots and lots of people out there can talk about trust and talk about psychological safety. And yet the question is, how do we make that happen? That's the key part. So actually spending time looking at how do we want to behave our way into this? What is it that we've got to do that actually does help people to feel like they're in a constructive, open conversation that is psychologically safe? And just in case anybody in here doesn't know, that doesn't mean that it's a lovely necessarily environment. Like psychologically safe environments are pretty gritty, but they're very productive in their grittiness.
Yeah. I think the other thing too for me is, if you're going into that um, new leadership position, unless you've been expressly told that changes need to happen within this team, you can take your time.
Oh yeah.
Odds are, right? The I think the reaction I've seen from new leaders at times in my career is they feel they have to go in and change everything and, show that they are doing something as a new leader. It's
Yeah.
probably okay to take your time to learn new people, to understand what's going on. Obviously, perhaps a little different if you're moving into leadership of a team you were once part of. There's nuance within there. But unless you're being told you need to go in and change things here, you probably have more time than you think.
I think you just hit the brilliant statement in there that I missed. And that is know your people.
Oh,
That's got to come before everything. And we've talked about that a lot, haven't we? Social capital and fika, the good Swedish term for it, but that connect before content. Where are you making time to build connection? And the pandemic really brought that to our forefront, but it's amazing how transactional we've become. So know your people before
yeah,
anything.
yeah. The other question that we have, and I love this because it gives us something to consider for a future episode as
Ooh.
well. Yeah. Would it be possible to schedule a 2025 session on performance for high performers? Right.
Yeah. Yep.
So that was the question, but I'm just going to throw it to you in terms of, some quick reaction and what you think, if you were to list off the one, two, or three things about leading high performers.
So this is where that, everything that we would normally run by and set your expectations, be clear. High performers get this. They knock those expectations. Expectations are almost like a what do you call that? Like it's in their way because they want to get up here and not be down
Yeah.
there. So I think the thing to remember with performance is what are the conditions that create high performance? And the conditions that create high performance, I'm really testing myself on a Friday morning here. Choice, challenge, um, purpose, attention, recognition, and there's one more. I can't remember it right now, but there's six conditions that create performance, the beauty of them is that they all intersect really quickly. So let's say I'm a high performer, rather than telling me where I'm going for the year, right? We talk about the difference between performance review and performance preview. So we're talking in performance preview, Jenny, where do you want to go? There's the choice. Most people who are high performers are driven by a challenge, like they get it and they see it. So engage them, have that conversation. Your job as a leader is to ensure that it aligns with the direction and the value and everything else of the company. Like keep them on track, but keep them on track and let them go for the challenge. The minute that somebody is going for a challenge, they need support. Doesn't matter if you think they're brilliant and they're good and they can just do it. They need that support in that challenge, but we thrive on those challenge situations. And when you look at that, you can see the choice was Jenny's. She picked the challenge. The window is open now to pay attention. And those 6 carry on. And I love that you put and one more. When we put the email together, we'll tell you what the full 6 are. So that's one part. And then the other thing I'll say for high performers too, and this is probably a conversation all of its own, is a high performer that is toxic is actually a disaster for your team.
Yep.
And it doesn't matter how brilliant they are, that toxicity will ruin everything else. And we talked about this last time, actually. I think the general rule of thumb is you got to move them either on within the company or up and out potentially, because that's not going to help anybody anywhere else.
Yeah. No, your lone wolf high performer is, perhaps brilliant for short-term results, but just disastrous for long-term culture. They're like that's a culture killer, right there. When you you get what you tolerate, right? Took
There you
me a
go.
while to find those words. Oh boy, it's been a long year, Jenny. I think one final thing that we could touch on before we move on to, you have a number of gifts for everybody
I
at
do.
this end of year episode. And so
Yeah.
we're going to start our wrap up a little earlier than usual. But I think the other thing that really stood out to me this year, because we said it a lot and it's worth double clicking on, is the whole concept of calling in versus calling out.
Mm. Hmm.
And so maybe if you could elaborate on that for everybody, because I think it is such an important piece and a tough one at times when you're in the heat of the moment to remember.
Yeah, for sure. So those wanting to go find the longer version, that was our conversation with John Partington, which is podcast. And we also, the webinars are available too. You can watch if you prefer. The difference between calling in and calling out. We call out if it's in public, in front of other people. The problem with calling out a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time, is it can lead to blame, shame, and judgment really quickly. And people don't always mean, the intention is different than the impact. And so there is the odd time, and John talks about this in that conversation, when calling out is appropriate, right? Just the 1 or 2 odd times. But calling out generally embarrasses somebody. Calling in is where we have a one-on-one conversation. And one of the keys, I think, is the proximity to where and when that's happened. And so sometimes we may even have to take time within a meeting, 5-minute break, 10-minute break, have that conversation then. Sometimes it's after a meeting. Sometimes you've been observing something if you're working face to face on, within your office environment, and then you might call in, it's a private conversation. And really it becomes a learning conversation. And sometimes, and this is really key too, if I'm calling somebody in, I need a growth mindset too, because I might learn something as well. I am seeing it from my perspective in that situation. They have a perspective in that situation as well. So calling out is public, calling in is private conversation.
Yeah, and for me, it kind of somewhat, for the most part, follows the term of praise in public, you
Yeah,
know, coach in private. Though you have to, again, going back to knowing your people, there are some who do not want the praise in public either,
100%.
right? You got to be really careful with that. So,
Yeah.
so Jenny, I think, like I said, when we were going through all the gifts that you have for everybody today, I said this could be the entire conversation, but we're going to start our wrap up a little earlier than we normally do, folks, because I think there is a ton here in the next 10 to 15 minutes that you're going to take away. So.
All right, let's do that. So if you are looking at us on the screen, the slides are back up again. If you're not, don't worry, I will talk to them. You definitely don't need to see them. You might be interested to come back later. That's up to you. So we always end these conversations with one big idea, theoretically 2 applied strategies. I have 3 today. And then Craig asked me for 3 questions that we could ponder, noodle, relevant to where we think the conversation will go. As always, I didn't really know where today's conversation would go. So I picked one big idea is Michael Bungay Stanier, as I said. If you want a brain break over the holidays, watch his TED Talk on advice monsters. I think I've now seen it probably over about 100 times and I still guilty daily. But his big thing within there is, can we stay curious longer? And when I think of all the conversations that we've had over the past year here, but also in all the classrooms that I have wandered in and out of, or stages that I've been on, this is one sentence we could do with remembering. And staying curious longer means a really healthy curiosity into how another person sees the same situation. Staying curious longer is not veiling your opinion. It's not asking those why questions that put people on their back foot. It is that genuine, healthy curiosity that leads us to see another person. So I think 2025, we'd all benefit from holding that one in the back of our minds. So as we move into strategies, my aim today is I'll give you something for the workplace, but maybe something to move through your holidays with, for those of you who are celebrating holidays over the next few weeks. And there are numerous holidays too that you can lean into. So the first one, we have had this before, is the power thank you. Now, we've talked a little bit about feedback and about recognition and those kind of things today. And that power thank you comes from Mark Goulston, has 3 parts to it. You can see them up on that screen there. So we're very good usually at just saying, thanks for that. That was great. Actually, what a power thank you does is shifts the ground underneath people's feet just a little bit. If I was offering it to you listening to us today, I might say thank you for making time for us every Friday session that we appear. We know there's a few names that are always here. Doesn't matter who you are, whether it's your first time today or your 70th time, we appreciate you being here. And we know that that takes time in your day, maybe a little bit of effort to fill in our registration form and join our crew. And for some of you, courage as you put your questions and your thoughts into the chat. But because of that, these conversations are rich, they're divergent, and honestly, they're the part that we look forward to on Fridays as well. So take your power thank you. You can write it, you can text it, you can Teams it, you can speak it. That would be a movement for everybody this holiday or in 2025. Our second one, and Craig went on a mission to try and guess what these meant. I thought we'd said them a lot, so I'll fill in the blanks for you. This is every day, anywhere, any place. Be kind to yourself. This is a gift for you. So rather than making that inner critic come to life, let's bring out something a little bit more healthy than the critic. So www, what went well? When you get to the end of today, what went well? When you get to the end of a presentation, what went well? When you've hosted a meeting, what went well? You made Christmas dinner, if you're celebrating Christmas, what went well? Something will have gone well. Notice that, lean on that. There's a lot of good chemistry in that thought. And then for those of you who are striving, then EBI is even better if, right? What went well today? What would make tomorrow even better? End of a project. What went well? What would make it even better next time we work? This is a really good frame to approach problems, yourself, present, your sort of performance, if you like. Now I've added one, and yeah, I was thinking about the holidays with this one and colliding with different people, but I think this is good for the workplace too. So still what went well, always going to lean on what went well. But the second one there, make someone else look good. And when you make someone else look good, you've got their back. You're helping them to look brilliant. These are the basics of collaboration. And this doesn't happen a lot in a transactional environment. It's actually work to make someone else look good. And so I think that's a really cool part that we could start to think about over the holidays and then bring back to work in 2025. And then the last one, and this is because it is a little bit stressful at this time of year for an awful lot of people. And we've talked about sort of valuing the pause. Take a moment, get both of your feet back on the ground, and then take that pause. So if you haven't heard of it before, there's a version of box breathing on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. You can do it. In fact, cell phones have apps often where you can trace your finger. You could do it if you were looking at a piece of paper. You can just do it in your mind. All right, big, deep breath in, hold that breath for a couple of seconds, and then exhale. And as you come back across the bottom, and this is where it's different, I just add in for the, like, just smile. And when we smile, we dump a whole load of good chemistry into our system. And you can even cheat. You can get a pen and put it right to the back of your mouth. It tricks your brain into thinking you're smiling. If you put it too close to the front of your mouth, your brain thinks you're frowning. So make sure you put that pen right to the back of your mouth. But it just changes the way that we show up. And in our mad busy season, I was actually out and ventured into one of the malls yesterday. There's a lot of people that could do with just a pause. Right? That person who's serving you behind the counter, they've served 55 versions of you already. Just pause before you smile at them and wish them a happy holiday or something. This can take us a long, long way. And this works at work too. And that pause is going to be huge. And then we have our questions. So rather than three, because it's the end of the holidays, I thought I'd give you loads of questions. And so I picked, I don't even know how many is there. I just picked my favorites. We have had over 60 questions this year that we've posed to you. And so as you look at those down the screen, there'll be one that will jump out to you. And your challenge for the day is find one. Find one, noodle it for a little bit, reflect on it, maybe jot yourself a note, maybe leave yourself a note for 2025 so that you can start on the right foot there. But one of the questions that we use a lot when we're working with leaders is what's important now. The acronym for what's important now is WIN. And that can be an incredible question when your emotional intensity has gone up and you feel that you can just feel everything exploding. What's important now? It might be to leave. It might be to deal with the issue. It might be when you're feeling the stress of busyness and you have little people in your house and they want your attention. What's important now? This is a great question. Find the win and live within that win. It's a very easy way to move forwards. So, Craig, that was one idea, 3 strategies given, and a whole ton of questions to finish off 2024.
Well, it is the season of giving, Jenny. So
There you go.
it's fantastic, as usual. Yeah, there's some great questions in there. MSLG, I also, as Jenny and I were going back and forth on this yesterday, I was like, what's WWWEBI? And then I was like, margaritas, scotch, lager, and gin. I thought that was appropriate perhaps for the season. But she said, no, that wasn't it. So with that in mind, we want to thank you all so much for joining us over the past year. If you're new to us, thank you as well. These conversations, I think Jenny and I would have them impromptu otherwise, but your participation just means the world to us. It makes the conversations that much richer. We appreciate all that you bring to it. So thank you for that. We'll be back, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be back in the new year on January 17th. And Jenny, with that, thank you. I appreciate you. Have yourself a wonderful next week, whether you're celebrating or not. And look forward to seeing everybody in the new year. Take care.
Thanks, Craig. Take care, everybody. Happy holidays.